Thank you, Simon Napier-Bell, for making your way over from
Jane, for
OS.
fixing everything. Yes.
We're very, very lucky to have Mr. Napier-Bell, and many thanks to Bigsound for organising this. And I guess you guys are here because you want to hear some great stories, some sordid pop stories. Simon has basically been around since the 1960s in showbiz and has managed the likes of Dusty Springfield, Marc Bolan and T-Rex, Jimmy Page, pre-Led Zeppelin in the Yardbirds, Sinéad O'Connor, Ultravox, Japan, Asia, Candi Staton, the list is endless. It's quite fitting that I should be speaking to you now because there's two important bits of news, Simon, that have made their way into the music news today. Number one of your former clients, George Michael, Wham, released his first posthumous single yesterday.
Fantasy, yeah.
With Nile Rodgers producing.
Remixing or...
Remixing. And of course, Sinead O'Connor has just announced that she's going to go on Dr. Phil to talk about mental health problems.
Well, she's been talking about that for some time, but maybe she's going to talk about it in a different way. Well, George's posthumous record, I don't know. I don't know who wanted it out and why they put it out and why they chose that one. It sounds very Nile Rodgers, which I like a lot. And I don't think it's one of George's best songs, but it's these things happen. I really haven't got any comment about it. I thought it was in one of his more average songs, but very well produced, because that's what Nile does. And Sinead, you know, she's been through a lot of difficulties and obviously needs a lot of help. But talking about it is a major part of getting the help, so that's good.
All of us are here because I guess we want to, you know, everyone who's in a band or works in the music industry, they want to get to the next level. Everybody wants to be successful. You come across people that want to be stars all the time. How do people get successful? Or, you know, you say there's a famous quote by you that, you know, for every person that knocks on your door and wants to be a star or get to the next level, only one or two perhaps will make it.
Well, there's no question. It's a complex thing what a star is, or what a performing artist is. But in fact, it also relates to an awful lot of other types of artists, and painters and all sorts of things. But generally speaking, artists who are really driven to be artists and create, they usually suffer something in their childhood which forces them away from normal society. And nearly every single major artist had some sort of childhood trauma, which they have probably got over by the time they're 12 or 13 or 14. But it's left them feeling very uncomfortable with something inside themselves they want to solve or help or heal. And that usually comes with some sort of creativity, writing songs or whatever. And when artists come to me, or potential artists come to me, aspiring artists come and say they want to be an artist, you know, in many ways, even the singing or the ability to dance or even to write songs is not the most important thing. It's to assess if they really have this incredible inner drive to push themselves through to do that. Or in fact, they have nothing else they can do. I mean, inside themselves, they think about, if I can't do that, I have nowhere to live. I mean, Sinead O'Connor said to me, you know, the music industry saved my life. I would have ended up in prison. You know, I was a reprobate. There was no way I could fit in with life. Most major stars have some element of that in them. And so that's sort of what you're looking for. And you're looking for somebody who has this... I don't have a drive. I couldn't care less if this person's a star or that person's a star. It's them who have that. I can tell them how to do it, provide the facilities, give them the infrastructure, but that drive has to come from them. If they don't have it, they're not going to succeed. Very often I have parents come to see me and say, oh, my daughter, she sings magnificent, she can sing better than Maria Carey. And they can. I listen to them, I say, they're fantastic. I say to go, do you want to be a star? No, not really, I want to get married. You know, it's a lot of very talented or very accomplished musicians don't have that star drive in them. So that's the drive you're looking for. When Simon Cowell talked about the X Factor and set up that program, that's what they're looking for, really. They're not looking for somebody who can juggle 17 balls on his head or something. They're looking for somebody who... It's just desperate love, a need for love and affection of an audience. That's what stars need. It's something making up for something they missed in childhood. So that's what you look for. And a lot of people might say that the industry, if you like, preys on people who have this slight mental disability, that they can't live in normal society, they have to be artists. So the industry knows very well that it depends on people with some sort of mental health problems for its source material. So then you'd have to discuss how cynical that might be.
Wham, George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley. were a young band in England in the early to mid 80s. And you get this call asking if you'd manage them. They'd already had a couple of hits.
No, you got that story all wrong.
Have I?
No, I met up with a guy called Jazz Summers who'd had a couple of quite big acts, not as big as the acts I'd worked with, but he'd had an act called Blue Zoo, had a top 5 record, and it had broken up. And he came to see me and said he thought if we got together we could really do something big. And I said, well, I'd been managing Japan for 6 years and they'd just broken up. And I said, I don't want to do any more management. And he said, oh, don't worry. You don't have to do it. If we can come together, I can use your name to get a really big act and I'll do all the work. And I said, well, it just, things don't work like that. If I'm involved, if it's you and me together, I'm going to do half the work. That's how I do things. And actually, I thought it was a really bad idea, but we went and had lunch, and by the end of the lunch, I was rather enamored of him. He was as different from me as I could ever imagine anybody. I mean, he liked to confront things where I liked to be circumspect. He spoke deliberately with a sort of a lower class accent, which he didn't really have because he was quite well brought up with his father in the army. But everything about him was confrontational, and that's the opposite of me. But I thought about it and thought that might be a good combination, and I liked him. And he was quite clever, and he'd lived in China for 5 years, in Hong Kong when he was in the army, and had learnt to speak Cantonese, so he wasn't a fool in any way. So we said, all right, let's do this together. Let's really work and use both our strengths and cap each other's weaknesses. But we can't be bothered finding a new group and spending that awful 2, 3, 4 years where you try to make a new group happen. Let's find a group which is already happening to some degree and then take them to another level. And we sat down and we wrote out the names of the current groups who had had 1 or 2 hits.
Right.
And they included Culture Club and Eurythmics, ABC, and Wham. And we looked through that list and researched them, and we found that Wham didn't actually have a manager. They were being looked after by their lawyer, and their publisher, because they had signed a publishing deal, was somebody who Jazz knew. So we went to see the publisher, and he fixed a meeting. And in actual fact, we fixed a meeting at my house, and they didn't turn up. And in those circumstances, I would phone very politely, so I'm so sorry you couldn't make the meeting, could we make another one? But Jazz, who was confrontational, phoned up, and he was really rude. He got George on the phone. He said, what do you mean, fixing a meeting, you don't come to the meeting? That's not how to behave. You come to another meeting. And I was amazed that he could do that, because I would never treat an artist like that, especially before I knew him even. And George came, and George and Andrew came. And so they came, and we had a meeting, and that's when it was decided. And they came in, we'd seen them on Top of the Pops in the first record they'd had, and they looked like a couple, almost like a twins. I mean, not looking alike in a twins way, but behaving alike. There were a couple of young lads around town who went clubbing and picked up girls, and they came in the house, and they were so completely different. Andrew was exactly what he seemed to be when you saw Wham on stage, and George was something quite different. He was very inquisitive, he was very distrustful, he wanted to know everything. He said, we're going to want top accountants, the very best accountants. And I said, yes, well, that's normal. He said, we want a second lot of accountants to check on the first accountants. From the very beginning, he was mistrustful as everything. But in the end, they agreed that we should become their managers. And they said, well, we wanted the biggest group in the world, and you've got 1 year to do it. And I said, well, it's impossible, because the biggest group in the world has to be the biggest group in America too, because America then was 55% of the world market. And you cannot break America to the top level inside 2, 3, 4 years. You have to go there and tour and go back and tour somewhere bigger and again and again. There was no national press in America. MTV had only just started. And George said, no, we don't want to do that. You've got 1 year. And then during that dinner, we came up with the idea of, well, perhaps you could be the first ever Western pop or rock group to play in China. And
which is very forward thinking. So, George Michael says you've got a year to make us big, huge around the world, and you come up with the idea of taking a band to China. Now, no Western artist had played China before. There'd been Jean-Michel Jarre dabbling.
I think it was a good couple of bottles of claret which came up with the idea, not me.
So it was the wine talking and not yourself?
Well, the idea popped out of a bottle towards the end of the dinner. And, I love Asia, so I said, that's a good idea, I'll do that.
So you gave yourself that challenge. Oh, George gave it to you, but you gave yourself that challenge. I'm going to make Wham the biggest band in the world.
Well, that's what I did, and 2 weeks later I was off to China. Without a visa, you couldn't get it. It's difficult. Anyone who knows China now knows it as it is today. Difficult for you to imagine what it was like. But China then was pretty much like North Korea is today. You couldn't get in, you couldn't move, you couldn't be anywhere without being watched. Businessmen were not allowed to go individually, they had to go in a party. You couldn't get a visa in under 3 months, you had to have government permission and be invited by a state corporation. And I couldn't be bothered with any of that. And I heard from a friend that there was a place in Hong Kong, if you went there and you went to this little alleyway and up 3 flights of stairs, there was a man there you could pay, and he put something in your passport, not a stamp, a little bit of paper, and then if you took the train to Guangzhou, and where the immigration was, and you went to the far left desk, and if there was a chap there with a hat, he's got a mole there, that's Charlie. And you see Charlie and you show him a bit of paper. And it's ridiculous. So I got into China. And there I was in Guangzhou, which is only just on the border with Hong Kong, miles from Beijing, illicitly in China without any papers. And not speaking a word of Chinese.
And you've got this Western band called Wham that they've never heard of, and you're going to try and get them a gig.
And only one person in China is going to be able to say yes, and that is the president of China.
Is that right?
So there I was. And
so not very difficult then.
And 13, no, not very difficult. And 13 months later I did it.
13 months it took you. How many dinners, lunches?
Well, first I had to get to Beijing. And I infiltrated a Russian tourist party in Guangzhou. And so there was a girl guide who spoke quite nice English, who's a Russian, and spoke Chinese and English. And I said, can I come to Beijing with you? And she said, she didn't really think it was, she said, all right. I said, I need a ticket. Can I get a ticket? I can't buy a ticket. And she said, oh, I'll say you're one of the tour and you lost your ticket or something. So she bought me a ticket. So I flew to Beijing with these Russians. And then when we got to the airport, I just left them. And then I had to get to hotel, and Westerners were not allowed to stay anywhere except in a special pavilion which had been built by permission of the government for any Westerners who came to Beijing at the time. And I had to get there, and I couldn't speak Chinese. The whole thing was ridiculous. Somehow I got to this hotel. I got in, I got checked in. And it was a ridiculous hotel, this hotel, because this was Beijing in February. And in Beijing in February, it's about 20 degrees Celsius below zero, and it has a further wind chill of 20 degrees, so it's like 40 degrees below zero with a howling, freezing Arctic gale. And whoever built this holiday inn has saved money by using the plans from one they'd built in the tropics. It was a Hawaiian design. It's the same one you're going to find if you go to Maui. And so there were no passageways. So you came out of the reception, you had to go outside or walk down sort of Grecian pillared open walkways to get to your room in minus 40 degrees. So when you checked in, they gave you a great big coat. They gave you your room key in this big coat you could wear to walk to the room. Sad situation. So I went and sat in my room. I thought, what the hell do I do? I mean, how can I get Wham to China? This is lovely saying I love Asia, and I'll tell George I'll go to Asia, but here I'm sitting in this horrible place in the depth of winter. And I called the British Embassy, and they sent round a book by messenger which listed all the Chinese ministries written in English with their phone numbers. So I sat in that room for the rest of the day calling one ministry after another. And the big job was just to find someone at the other end of the phone who spoke English, and sometimes it's only the cleaning lady. And every time I found someone who spoke English, I said, could you say that Simon Napier-Bell's come from London to take the minister to lunch? And I left that message in about 15 ministries. And then I decided I didn't like it in Beijing, so I flew to Thailand and went on the beach for 3 days. And went back to London, and I told Jazz and the group, it's going brilliantly, it's fantastic. In no time at all, we'll all be in China. And I went back a month later, same horrible holiday, the same little place in Hong Kong where I got the bit of paper, but I've already now worked out a way of getting the flight to Beijing. And when I got to the holiday inn, they said, you've got a message. And I'd got a message. One of the people I called last time was coming round. And it was from Mr. Li Ping Wei, and he was the Minister of Energy. Which I couldn't understand why he was coming to see me. But,
the Minister of Energy to talk about a pop group, that makes complete sense.
I just say I wanted to buy him lunch. And so he arrived, but you have to think, it's so difficult to imagine. In 1985, everyone in China wore a Chairman Mao suit, that dreary, high-collared, dark blue suit. Everybody, every girl, every man, every teenager, every under 10 wore a little one. And girls weren't allowed to wear makeup. And there were no cars in Beijing at all, The only cars were great big black limousines called Red Sun limousines. And everyone had bicycles. And the Minister of Energy, that's going to be one of the top 5 ministers in any country. You might get a decent car here in Minister of Energy and drive around in Camel, wouldn't you? You would in London. And he kept riding on his bicycle, and he came in the lobby in his Chairman Mao suit with his bicycle, pulling them off as he came in the lobby, and said, very pleased to meet you, very pleased to discuss you want to buy coal. And I said, I don't really want to buy any coal. And I said, it's a bit of a mistake. And he got me muddled up with some Norwegian guy he was meant to be seeing. But I did buy him lunch anyway, and he spoke quite good English. Right. And I explained, I didn't say I wanted to bring Wham to China. I just said, it'd be very nice one day, I thought, if there could be some sort of musical exchange between, Western youth culture and Chinese youth culture. And he said, oh, that'd be a very nice idea.
Yeah, because you write in your book that you can't, to do business with the Chinese, you can't ask them, can we do this? Well, you have to put the idea in their head. And so you were always suggesting it would be very nice if
The thing about China, and actually all of Asia, in fact, all cultures which have as their basic derivative culture a Buddhist religion as the basis of the culture, is part of that, is that you don't ask confrontational. It's very rude to be confrontational, I mean, in England, some things are rude, like how many pieces of toilet paper to use when you go to the bog, that's a bit rude in English. But in China, to ask any question which demands a yes or no answer is, do you like this? I'll say, well, on a nice day it can be. They don't say yes or no. And so even to ask a simple question which demands a yes or no answer is rather rude. And most people don't understand that. And also, it's going to put an end to anything you're negotiating, because if the answer is no, you're finished. And I like going to China, because I've now realised that every time I went to China, I could go for 3 days to the beach in Thailand.
Of course.
And I took a round-the-world fair, and on the way back, I had 3 days on the beach in Acapulco. So this is a good thing for me. Wow. Meanwhile, Jazz stayed in London and managed the group. So I just went every month, and the first minister said, the food's terrible in Beijing. And this food here in this hotel is the only place with good food, because you have to pay your bill in dollars, so they have money to buy good food. And if you invite ministers here, they'll come. So he helped me. And each month I got more. I got 3 and then 4, and then they bought the translators, and I had 10 people to lunch and 20. And for 13 months, by the 13th month, I had 18 or 19 people coming. And the president complained he couldn't have a cabinet meeting when I was in town. So obviously my fame was spread. I knew I was getting there.
And sure enough, with your wouldn't it be nice if Wham could play, they finally said?
Well, I started off saying, it'd be really nice. I didn't say, could we do it? I said, it'd be really nice if one day there was a cultural exchange. And then the next dinner I said, if it was a cultural exchange, it'd be really nice if it was musical, because you don't have to think of language, everyone can understand it. And then the next dinner I said, oh, by the way, you remember I mentioned music? Well, I actually manage a musical group, but I didn't go further than that. And each time it went a little further. And like on the very last dinner I said, you remember when I said I manage a musical group and it's called Wham, and it'd be nice if there was an exchange, and it would be really nice if that exchange happened to take place on April the 22nd, but still didn't ask a question.
But you're putting everything out there.
Yeah. But eventually, I was taken. It was this last lunch, the 13th lunch, one of the translators, and the translators, you've got to remember, are the real power behind the thing. All these ministers have government translators. The translators are secret police. So the secret police are reporting back to the senior secret police. That's how the country was run at that time. And the ministers have reasonable power, but they're not the all-powerful people I think they are. And one of the translators said, I'd like to take you to see the Minister of Culture. And the Minister of Culture was obviously the one person I needed to see, and he'd never come to my lunches. And he took me in the car to the guy's office. And he had a red phone on his desk. And a red phone meant that was the phone which went to Deng Xiaoping. That was the head of China. And he didn't even talk to me much. He'd always been told everything which by then I'd been talking to them about so long. And he picked up the red phone and spoke. So I knew he was talking to the President of China. And then he gave me a little bit of paper and said, we've invited your group to come and play on
Bingo.
20th of April.
Okay, but after that, round of applause. Finally, 30 lunches later. But it wasn't that easy after that, though, because at the time, now correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just remembering what you wrote in the book, though. Chinese people weren't allowed to see pop groups or couldn't buy tickets to go and see Wham.
Look, first of all, and this is true today, if any of you are doing business in China, the Chinese are utterly brilliant at making you pay. You pay everything. It's a privilege to come and do business in China where you have to pay for that privilege. And they'll invite you to a dinner. I don't know if any of you guys have been to China and you get invited out. But normally speaking, they'll say, we'll take you. There's a place called the State Guest House where they have 35 rooms varying from 15 to 200. And they have these big dinners. But you get the bill afterwards.
Right.
And so we finally got invited. But I came back and told the Western press, we'd been invited to China. They said, amazing, but why why Wham? Why not Billy Bragg, who's like a left-wing, communist-inclined person? And of course, the Chinese are very clever. They know that people who rebel in one country rebel in another. If Billy Bragg lived in China, he'd be a right-wing fascist. That's what he likes to do, rebel against the establishment. Wham are people who fitted in. They went along with what they'd assessed.
Nice pop music.
They'd assessed the risk. And the deal I'd made in Always Talking over 13 months was, if you invite Wham or a pop group, the benefit you get is the whole world will think you're opening up. If you invite foreign youth culture into China, that's the absolute telltale sign that you're opening up, you're freeing your thinking. And I couldn't give a damn if nobody in China knows they come. All I want is the rest of the world to see them coming.
You wanted the world's media
So
there.
we were allowed to we had 90 television crews, 90 television crews in the concert hall. The whole of the front of the hall was not for audience, it was for television crews. And it went out everywhere in the world. And their idea was to get investment. If people thought we were opening up, they're going to bring investment to China. Now, this is their way of getting foreign investment. That's the deal I made with them. You get foreign investment, I turn Wham into the biggest group in the world in 1 year, which is what I meant to do. And so it was a deal with the devil to do that. But I paid. They knew I was going to pay. We had to hire a jumbo jet just for equipment. They didn't have fuse wire. They didn't have a spotlight. Every single thing was taken. And we had to pay the person who sat at the box office and sold the tickets, and the money from the tickets went to the government. We had to pay to print the tickets. We paid absolutely everything. The tickets were sold, they were very careful, tickets were sold to workers who'd done well in farms and the countryside, so they didn't want any disruption in the city. They didn't want Beijing students and lefties, lefties in China would be righties, weren't they?
Which is a strange audience for a Wham pop concert, like a farmer.
No, but we had a problem because I told the Western press, they said, why were Wham invited? I said, because everybody in China loves them. Their records are #1. And the Western press, wow, it's amazing. And they were all coming to the gig. And so I thought, this is going to be really embarrassing. And so when we sold the tickets, before we sold the tickets, I went to Hong Kong and got a top Mandarin singer from Beijing to fly down. And we recorded all of Wham songs in Chinese.
Very clever.
And we made a cassette, and on one side was Wham songs in English, and the other side were all these Chinese cover versions. And then with each ticket, I thought we'd give one away, and then each person who bought a ticket would learn the songs. And then I had a better idea. I'd give 2 away, because by then I was beginning to think, well, I want to be a bit subversive. And if we give 2 away, they'll keep one and they'll sell the other one, which will pay the cost of their ticket, and it will spread a little bit.
That is nuts.
So when we got there, they all knew the songs. And all the Western press said, wow, it's amazing, they really do know their song.
And wasn't there a famous quote from, I don't know if it was a music journalist or a photographer, who said that years after Wham had played China, that famous show, for years and years afterwards, you could hear Wham, that's all you could hear was Wham songs.
Yeah, it was, what's his name, a very famous author who writes travel books, and he wrote a book called Beyond the Great Wall. And it's 5 years later, and he said everywhere he went, he heard Wham songs.
Because of those cassettes that were sold with those tickets.
Well, of course, they were copied, you know. The extra ones were sold in the market, and then kids copied them. So they did, it did spread the word, and they did become Ruva.
I remember being a 10-year-old in the 80s, and my music Bible was Smash Hits, the magazine. And it was such a big deal, Wham playing China. It was obviously front page of Smash Hits, and inside, there was 6 pages dedicated to Wham in China. It was very, very big news in music industry circles. I'm thinking George Michael never said thank you, because pop stars do. But, you did it in a year. You rose to the challenge and you pulled it off.
18 months it took in the end. I think he complained. We finished up, we went from China to America, and they'd already had a hit in America, but they weren't big enough to play stadium tours. We went from China, we booked a stadium tour straight away in America. Not a big one, 8 dates, but big stadiums, 80,000, 90,000. And we finished up, we couldn't get a date in LA, so we had a row with the promoter, tried to keep us out of LA, but we had the idea of using the race course, which had never been done. And it's not the best place for a gig, because the grandstands are long, straight grandstands, so people at the end, however luxurious it might be, are looking a long way. But anyway, we did the race course. And it was a fantastic gig, absolutely amazing. And it was hugely successful. Everybody came, absolutely everybody. From Burt Bacharach and Dionne Warwick down to Elton. And after the gig, and it was a good gig, Elton came crashing into the dressing room and gave everybody a hug and said, amazing. And George, it took me 6 years, and you've broken America in 18 months. And George turned around to me and said, you see you failed. But he did smile a little bit. which he didn't always do.
Well, I guess the biggest challenge for you then was keeping Wham together, because George obviously had written Careless Whisper. He'd had that for years and years and years. He'd been sitting on it. But I guess once he got a taste of success and things started happening and changing, it was about keeping Wham together for a little bit before he went off and became a solo artist. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, George was uncomfortable with Wham. And Wham was an idea which George and Andrew had when they were at school. They met when they were 12, and George went to a new school, and Andrew was already there, and he was like the lad around the classroom, the handsome guy everybody loved, made jokes and made the girls faint. And George was a spotty, little, fat, curly-haired Greek boy with glasses, and he was sat next to Andrew and sort of looked up, wow, I sort of, look at this guy moving. And bit by bit, he persuaded his mother to let him change. He went on a diet. He got contact lenses. His mother bought him a hair straightener. And bit by bit, he tried to turn himself into a replica Andrew. And he always saw Andrew as this sort of god of how you're meant to look. And then he had this, he was crazy about pop and very clever at writing songs, as we know. So he had this idea, he would write songs for a pop group, be Andrew and another guy like Andrew. They'd find the right guy. And they'd be these, what we saw later with Wham. And they looked and couldn't find the right person. And so eventually George said, oh, let's get on with it, I'll do it. So George became the second person. So when people say, oh, Andrew was nothing in the group, it was all George, it's absolutely the opposite. The entire image and projection of Wham was Andrew's. And when I started managing, I thought this image cannot go wrong, because an image which is based on a real relationship, two friends of 8 years, it wouldn't matter if they fight and quarrel, that's still going to be great publicity. It's a genuine thing, they're going to stay together. But what I didn't realize is it wasn't as real as it looked, because Wham wasn't Andrew and George, it was Andrew, the real Andrew, and Andrew, the fake Andrew. And as George got older and probably realized his sexuality, he found himself more and more uncomfortable being a fake Andrew. And that's what was pulling him apart. It wasn't ego, it wasn't a dislike of Andrew, it was just that he was right. He created like a film scenario. It wasn't like a pop scenario. And it was a heterosexual film scenario. It was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, or Starsky and Hutch.
Two best mates having a ball playing pop tunes.
And he got more and more uncomfortable with having to play. He didn't want to be false, he wanted to be out. So eventually he said, I just can't do it, I've got to leave. But of course, when he left, that was the key moment when he should have come out. Yeah. And he lost his courage, and the record company, he suddenly realized they would dismiss him. And so instead of coming out, he then he created a new image, which was George Michael, the heterosexual pop singer, but not what he wanted to do. And it took him another 10 years. And
obviously when you were managing him, he wasn't out, but and he never actually told you he was gay, but you kind of had an idea, didn't you?
Well, I'm gay. You sort of know who's gay and who isn't. And I had gay friends and so on. That chap you manage, and I meet him here and I meet him there. I mean, if he knew I was gay. If he didn't want to talk about it, it's nothing to do with me, really. It's his private life. Yeah. He did his work as a singer and a member of Wham perfectly, and it's up to him what he talks about. Yeah. But yes, I knew, of course.
But I remember he was dating Brooke Shields for a while. I mean, press will tell
well, that
you
was the
anything.
period when anyone was accused of being gay, if she was free for that month, you'd wheel out Brooke Shields and say you're having an affair.
I think they did that with Michael Jackson as well.
Michael Jackson did it for a while, Andrew Agassi did it for a while, and then he decided he wasn't gay anyway, so he didn't need her anymore. Yeah, I mean, she was a bit all-purpose. She was the
beard, as it were.
The aspiring gay straightener, yes. That's right.
The gay straightener, I love it. So, how did you react when he was discovered in the toilet block in LA many, many years later? Very established artist, very well known.
It's not a great way to come out, but he obviously wanted to come out. That was his way. It was obviously deliberate. I mean, he wouldn't have known he was being deliberate, but it was obviously deliberate. He spent a week before he was discovered lying in that park, which is a well-known gay cruising area, and there'd been pictures of him in the News of the World in England prior to that event happening. What's George Michael doing lying in his bikini in this park? He obviously hadn't. It's like when you want to break up with somebody in an affair, and you don't quite have the courage to sit down and say, look, it's not working out, let's talk about this. What you do is you create a row, and that's sort of what he was doing. He's creating a row. And obviously, I think he said later in interviews, he realized later that it was sort of deliberate. And then he dealt with it as, George is somebody who, I've got a very similar personality in this, that I like, I'm at my best when I'm dealing with a problem. Oh. I like a good problem, and then everything comes together. And so, you know, he immediately he went straight onto television, did an interview on CNN, came back and talked on Parkinson. He revelled in solving the problem. That's what he liked doing.
Do you think it had any adverse effect to his career at all?
Of course. America was totally homophobic. It's changing now, but it's taken a long time to change. I mean, he didn't sell records, he didn't tour, he didn't make any money out of America ever again.
Wow. Big thing.
Yeah.
Big thing. This is about the gentle art of managing pop stars. How much bullshitting is involved in managing pop stars, to them, to PR people? How much bullshitting do you do?
You mean on a percentage scale of everything you say? Well, it's around 99%, isn't it? I mean, look what a manager's job is. You have, in an extreme sense, but this is true, you have an artist who is, I'm not overstating it, but, you know, artists are people who don't fit into normal society. They're not going to get a job at a bank. They're probably incapable of it. As I said, Sinead said, if I hadn't the music business, I would have ended up in jail. She probably would. A lot of artists don't know what the hell going to do. So the music business sort of rescues them. It gives them a chance to do something. But they aren't part of what the music business is. But unfortunately, what a lot of them fail to realize is the minute you sign a record contract, you're no longer an artist. An artist sings in the garden for birds. You know, the minute you sign a record contract, you have joined the music business. Maybe your job is singing and their job is selling the records, but you're in the music business. And they find that difficult to accept or believe, and they argue and they talk about the company being insensitive, but they've just signed a contract saying, well, I want to join this insensitive business. That's their fault. But they are, nevertheless, these slightly unstable people who want to assuage some sort of hurt inside themselves by creating something. On the other side, you have people who are only interested in money, nothing else. You might have people working in a record company who love music, who love this, but the people who invest, the shareholders, the stockholders, the people who own it, are only interested in making a profit. And so you're bringing together this extreme artistic sensitivity with something which is utterly insensitive and only interested in the very opposite of what the artist wants. You have to find meeting ground. So the record company sensibly employs people who like music, who also like commerce, they like their salary, they like being employed. And the artist employs somebody like a manager who has some feeling for the artistry, but also can mix with the other side. And you're a bridge. And that's what you do the whole time. And so you bullshit the record company, you bullshit the artist. All you ever do is you tell lies to both sides. The artist says, do they understand my record? Do they really like it? Do they know what it's about? I said, oh, it's lovely. The manager in Get told me last night he took it home and his wife and him cried listening to it. You know? The managing director said, when does this bloody bullshit go out? When's that cocksucker going to finish his bloody record? You know, you lie to the artist. And, you know, and then the record company says, does George really understand? You know, the record has to be packaged this way, and we have to have it out the state. He's got to do lots of interviews, you know, and you know, we need to make money from it. I said, of course. He was worrying about it yesterday. He said, you know, am I giving enough? Can I give more? You know. I talked to George. He said, I'm not doing a single bloody interview. You know? That's what management's about. And any of you here are managers, you know I'm talking the truth. You know.
Well, it's interesting you talk about signing a record contract, an artist signing a record contract, and they become a commodity then. And I guess the biggest thing going on right now is, well, streaming was formerly an illegal enterprise, and now we've all accepted streaming. A lot of us don't understand it or how we make money from it, but this is a whole new enterprise for artists and for record companies, isn't it?
It's interesting, isn't it? You know, as a manager, your job doesn't change. You have artists, you have an industry, and the industry wants to make money, the artists want to be, they want to be loved by an audience. That's sort of what it's about. Nothing changes. The infrastructure, or how records are promoted, has changed and how money is made from them. But really, what a manager's job is hasn't changed in one bit. Just some of the elements of things you have to know about in order to make money from the artists have changed. We don't sell records, we get money from streaming. And there's so much rubbish talked about streaming. I mean, I just picked up an article last week that said, we had 1 million streams and my royalty check was only $4,000. This is outrageous. And the people writing, the journalists writing, say, oh, this is terrible, the end of the music. $4,000. You got 1 million streams, allowing it people who buy a record listen 100 times, that would be 10,000 records. What artist ever got $4,000 for the first 10,000 records he sold? The first 100,000, the record company will say you're still paying off recording costs. So this guy's done better than anyone's done in my period in the music business. So he's 1 million streams, he's got 4,000, and he's complaining to the journalist. So then I pick up another article. It says, you can make a fortune with streaming. It's absolutely wonderful. I made $56,000 out of 10 million streams. It's exactly the same proportion, 10 times. You know. And the people are just not thinking of what it is. That million, in a lot of artists' head, is a key thing. They think, oh, 1 million records, that's a big deal. This isn't 1 million records. This is 1 million listens. It's incredibly different. Streaming is excellent, and I think it's the way to go. It's extraordinary how long it took record companies to realize it and get involved with it. Doesn't really change the manager's job, and it does, what it does, for the record company, it changes a lot. I mean, they've had 50 years of selling a half-cent's worth of vinyl.
Yeah,
for
if you
$10.
think how inflated the price of vinyl was, it took half
half
a
cents
cent
worth
to
of
make,
vinyl.
and we've sold it for what, $25, $30 here?
10,000% profit. There's nothing in the history of retail business which comes near to 10,000% profit.
Which is
raw
ridiculous.
material to sell product. And that paid for, you know, huge buildings in New York and Nashville and Los Angeles.
And probably a lot of coke habits too.
Cocaine, limousines. And so they all come to a record company. Oh, sorry, all you record company, but I think you're all... Yes, you know it's true.
Yes.
It's a hard life now.
So streaming is okay.
Streaming is great, and the record companies have changed enormously. And I now meet heads of record companies everywhere in all cities who I respect and see that they know the business, they understand it. There's a huge change in what goes on in a record company. The number of people working in them has cut down, the waste and there's still a lot of drug taking, and I don't object to that, and especially if it's done in a leisurely way. I mean, it's a leisure enterprise rather than in the office enterprise. But it isn't on the record company's bill anymore, and that's a big difference. But you have to remember that for nearly 100 years, the record industry was in a legal enterprise, and this has always been an integral part of the record business. In 1918, when radio started in America and the UK and most of Europe and Australia, in all those countries, in every country, it was decided it was a public service, and in all those countries, because of that, it was illegal to advertise, and it was illegal to pay anyone in the record company to advertise or promote anything you gave them. And the only way you can get records and songs and new material played on a radio is to persuade somebody. And the way you persuade people is with money, or lunches, or dinners, or holidays. But
And what many of us know as payola,
that's what
I
we
guess.
call payola. Now, payola only applies because it's a public service and the law says you can't do it. So a Spotify playlist that's paid for, it's fine, it's not payola because this is a commercial enterprise. That's what we charge for our playlist. But because of that, really from 1918 till, say, 2008, the entire music industry was doing something illegal. No head of a major record company, no matter how much he's lauded and praised and gets awards and becomes an honorable member of the American Society of Capitalists, they had to indulge in a criminal activity. They somehow had to arrange that their records got played on the radio when they wanted them played, and it was paid for. And so that's infiltrated the record business. And of course, if you break the law in one area, you tend to be lax about it in another, which is probably the reason why so many record company contracts cheated the artists and put clauses in which were very unfair or allowed them not to pay royalties correctly. And that's always been part of the business. But, it's illegal, but we're not talking about human trafficking or making landmines and dropping in third world countries. We're talking about something rather naughty. Trying to popularize your record, it's not really very terrible. But the fact this illegality trickled through the business is what gave it this nice anti-authoritarian, anti-establishment air, which is part of the attraction for young people. And that's going, and it's getting more boring. Radio isn't so important. Streaming, you're allowed to do whatever you want. There's no payola in streaming. And record companies become more like normal industries of other sorts, and that sort of tinge of illegality goes, and it gets dull. And that's what's happening.
Take me back to when George Michael sued Sony. That was a huge case. What was going on there? What was the backstory?
George Michael sued Sony because one day he overheard Tommy Mottola on the phone calling him a limey faggot. And he was outraged, and so he should have been. And Tommy Mottola was head of Sony. He's the person George had to deal with continually, every day, at the top level. For 10 years, he had a record contract which went on for between 8 and 10 years. And he went to his lawyer and said, I shouldn't have to be tied for 10 years with a record company which can treat me with this disrespect. If I sign a contract, if Tommy Mottola said about his secretary, or even the office coffee bar, or the guy who drove the van and delivered the records, he was a limey faggot, there was a union who would take all the people in that union who worked for CBS out on strike instantly. And you'd have to apologise and send a letter of apology and probably pay damages as well. But artists never get this from record companies. And artists don't get health insurance, they don't get any of the things which a normal employee gets. And they're not employees, which is why, but it's still disrespectful. And of course, George's lawyer said, you can't fight the contract on that. You know, you have to fight it on the contract. So say, let's find something wrong with the contract, say this is wrong or that's wrong. But it wasn't. It was a contract. It had been enforced for 2 years, which means by George making records already under that contract, he'd technically called what they call affirming the contract. He'd signed it as an adult. He was pretty much doomed to lose because everything they fought the case on was things which weren't really very good things to fight a case on. They made up things which were wrong with the contract. I said to George, I wasn't managing him at the time, but I met him, I said, you should fight the case on that. You should go into court and say, you know, I should not be subjected to the head of a company I'm tied to, like it or not, for 10 years, calling me a limey faggot. And you still lose the case, but they'd settle quicker and for more and be embarrassed by it, and Tommy Mottola would probably get fired, and the shareholders of CBS would have to issue an apology. You know, CBS then was still a public broadcast company. You know, they still had to have a license to broadcast radio, and if that is publicised, they're going to very quickly try and rectify it. But I understand when George was persuaded by his lawyers, as we usually are, do it the correct way, and so he did. But it's a pity, because it would have been nicer the other way, much more confrontational, much more fun.
Did Tommy Mottola ever apologise, or was it?
I doubt it. He's not the apologising type.
No. Of all artists you've managed, who's been your favourite?
Oh, you're not allowed those.
You're not allowed? Are they like
You've got to be
children?
very,
Are they like
very,
children?
very
You're not allowed to
equal.
have a favourite child?
No, not really. You know, isn't it strange? They're very similar because artists are. I mean, they all come from almost the same background, so they need and want the same things. And the most difficult and annoying ones, which give you more trouble and make you more angry more often than the others, very frequently are the ones you look back on and think, well, you know, they're the ones I like best, or that you didn't at the time. I mean, Marc Bolan was a wonderful person to have around and was fun. And George was too. George wasn't fun. No, George was never fun, but he was a wonderful person to have around because he was completely self-sufficient and made his own music and wrote his own music. Jeff Beck I liked, but, you know, Jeff Beck was fun because he, only in retrospect, you know, he used to throw we did a tour of America and he threw his amps out the window every night and I had to find new amps. And I'm getting sued by people whose cars they landed on in the street and things like that. And then later on, I look back and I think, well, you know, that's the perfect rock star. What more could I ask for? So you can only have a favourite in retrospect. And in retrospect, you know, all the nasty things always fade away. The human brain's very good at remembering nice experiences. So in retrospect, they all become very lovable.
Right. Well, I love the story about Marc Bolan knocking on your door. Here's a man that was determined to be a star, or was definitely going to be a musician of sorts. And you get this knock on your door one day. What happens?
Well, I was at home, and actually I got a phone call. And it was a phone call and a voice I didn't recognise. I was said he used Simon Napier-Bell that managed the Yardbirds. The Yardbirds, you know, the Yardbirds and the Beatles and the Stones were the three biggest groups in the world in the 60s. So, yeah, I said, I am. And he said, oh, I've got a tape I want to play you. Can I bring it round? And I thought he'd be able to bring it round to the office the next day. I said, yes, you should bring it round and I'll listen. But 10 minutes later, there was a knock on the door, and somehow he got my home address, I don't know how. And I opened the door, and there was this very diminutive figure dressed like a Dickensian urchin in very scruffy little clothes. And he said, oh, I don't have a tape. He said, I've got the guitar, I'll play you the songs. And he had his tape guitar slung over his back. And I was, you know, I was a bit put out. It's 7:30 in the evening. I just had my first gin and tonic of the evening, and this horrible little chap's going to come and disturb my peace. And so to try to sort of intimidate him, I said, well, come on, play me a song, quick, please, out, get it done. And he looked around the room, and I had this one very big armchair, and he climbed up in it, not to sit in it like an armchair, but like a little elfin, sat cross-legged in the armchair and got his guitar out, and wasn't hurried at all. And he set it up. And he had a capo on the guitar too to help get to difficult chords. And he started on his first song. And he had this extraordinary trick, because he'd only learnt 3 chords, and some of the songs needed a 4th chord. But you could play them if you moved the capo. Normally, if you do that, you have to stop playing and get it. But he had this trick where we played it along, and he'd get to this place where he had the other chord. And so he'd stop strumming, and he'd bang, dum, 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 on the wood of the guitar. And with his left hand, he could unscrew the capo, move it up, screw it up again, and do it all within 1 bar. So he'd go, dum, 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 dum. And you looked at it, and you thought, it's incredibly clever. It's got to be a lot more difficult than learning the chord. I mean, what? So I was immediately impressed. And he went on for a whole hour, and at the end of an hour, I was mesmerized. I said, we're going right now to a studio. It's 9 o'clock at night. And we went to Kingsway Studios, 9 o'clock at night, and re-recorded the whole hour of songs he'd done, which eventually came out as an album called The Beginning of Doves. And then I took him to dinner, and we talked for 2 hours, and this is the sort of person you look for. I mean, he was full of him. I mean, he understood everything about how to project himself and how much he needed it, but he was full of himself. I said, he said, you didn't really need to record the songs. And I said, yes, I did. He said, no, I don't need to make records. If you just took a photograph and put a poster up of me all over London, I'd be a star. That's all I need. It took him a long time to realise there was a little bit of work involved in getting there. But yeah, he was lovable and fun, and later on when he became a star, he was brilliant at getting media. He'd say, 2 weeks, there hasn't been anything big in the press about me, so he'd just make a call. He'd get a journalist's phone number, call him up and say, well, can I do an interview? I've got a great story for you. I've just been offered a film. I go, some huge film star is going to be in it. I'm starring with Jane Fonda and Marlon Brando, and I'm the 3rd person in that movie. And it's about a pop star who goes to Hollywood and turns into a god. He just make this thing up, and they come rushing around and give me the interview, and then the other papers, I've heard the story coming. And for 3 days, you get all this press, and fine. Nothing came of it. And a few weeks later, they say, what's happened to that film? They say, Marlon Brando, I decided I didn't like him enough. He really was a master of press. And he understood that it didn't matter, because journalists don't mind. I mean, journalists will very rarely question, they don't want to question a story. If they've got a good story, they really don't want to sit down and say, you sure it's true? They're just happy to have it.
Yeah.
And with Pop, it didn't matter too much. He wasn't giving them stories which were life-shattering. So they all loved him. And you come up with a bit of journalism anytime.
Would you advise up-and-coming artists and singers and bands that, if they have a manager in mind, to knock on the door like Marc Bolan did with you?
No, I was very good-natured to sing. I can be bad-natured. When Wham were recording the video for Careless Whisper in Miami, we gave journalist passes to sing. They were very big then. They'd already had number 1 with Wake Me Up Before You Go. And we gave passes to only 6 journalists in the UK, including the New Musical Express. And on the 2nd or 3rd night I was in Miami, the journalist from the New Musical Express came into my room, and said, can I give you a cassette? And I was really angry. I said, look, you've got permission to come here as a journalist. You haven't got permission to come here so you can tap me up, and with your horrible music. And I took it and I threw it across the balcony. It fell in the sea outside.
And you're thinking, the cheek of this journalist giving me a demo tape when he's on a junket.
Yeah, well, it was Neil Tennant, and what he was giving me was the Pet Shop Boys' first album. So there, you see, I
missed opportunity there, Simon.
Didn't get to manage them.
Damn. Has anybody got any questions for Simon Napier-Bell? I'm sure you have many, and they can be as shocking and as polite as you like.
Shocking.
Does anyone want any career advice? Come on. Oh, let's talk about Jimmy Page. So you're managing the Yardbirds. The Yardbirds need a guitarist.
Well, the bass player left. I didn't know anything about management. I got to manage the Yardbirds long before I understood very much about the music business. I'd been a musician, and I'd been in the film business, and I became the manager of the Yardbirds. They knew more about the music industry than I did. And during about the first week into it, they were doing a gig in Paris, and I was walking along Champs-Élysées after the gig with the bass player, Paul Samuel-Smith, and he said, I hate playing live, I really hate it. I wish I could never travel again and play live. I like making records, but I don't like traveling or playing live on stage. And I didn't know that a group manager's first and foremost job above everything is keep the group together. You know, if you can keep a group together, you'll get hits eventually, even if they have conflicts. Sometimes the conflicts, I mean, it's just rock music, conflicts create some of the best music. Don't let them break up. And I didn't know that. So when he told me he hated it, I thought, you poor chap, I put my arm around him now. Poor chap, fancy doing something you don't like, that's awful. He said, I must help you leave. So I agreed, no, you better leave, it's awful, I'll find someone else to do it, somebody likes it. You know, we want a happy group here. So he left. And then suddenly I realized this was sort of a bit of a mistake. But I'd been around the business for a little bit by then, because I'd written some songs. I'd had You Don't Have to Say Love Me, which I wrote, and so I was always making demos of new songs. The publishers wanted me to come up with another song. And so I knew all the best session musicians in town, and amongst all the best session musicians, who were mostly pretty set in their way of being session musicians. They didn't want to tour, they didn't want to be in bands, they were family people. But there was one young guy who was really very, very good, and always very amenable and played extraordinarily well, and it was Jimmy Page. But he wasn't a rock musician. I mean, Jimmy Page played on all Mickey Mouse productions, Herman and the Hermits and things like this. I mean, you know, very inky-dinky sort of pop music. But I knew that he sometimes went out in the evening and played in clubs and sat in with rock bands and was well respected. So I just thought he'd work well, and I asked the guys in the band what they thought. And they said, he'll never agree to play bass. And I sort of knew he wouldn't either, but he did. But I knew he wouldn't. So he came into the band as the bass player, and it lasted one song. We were doing a gig, and halfway through the first song, he walked across to the rhythm guitar player, Chris, and he handed Chris his bass and took the rhythm guitar. And from that moment on, we had two lead guitars, no rhythm guitar at all. And Jeff stood one side of the stage, and Jimmy stood the other, and they played absolutely everything in unison. It was extraordinary, it was mesmerizing. In those days, there were no mixing desks. So you couldn't create the great sounds you made now. Everything came live off the stage. We had amplifiers piled up on the stage. So when they stood either side of the stage and played those guitar things in unison, this was a sound that couldn't be created anywhere except two guitarists doing it. And we did a tour with the Rolling Stones, and it was probably the Yardbirds at their very best, and they probably outplayed the Stones in a musical sense for the whole of that tour. But they weren't happy. I mean, you know, you think that's great, and they're all happy, but Jeff Beck wasn't quite so happy, because now it was all Jeff's solos, but Jimmy was playing them in unison and stealing Harvest Thunder. And Jimmy wasn't happy, because the solos he was playing were actually Jeff's solos, which he was just copying. So they were both a bit... And eventually that came to a sticky end too.
And we know what happened to Jimmy Page.
Yeah, he did quite well, didn't he? but Jeff does well still today.
It would be great to have a Yardbirds reunion of sorts. Has there been talk of that?
Jeff and Jimmy have played together a few times. I mean, no, they're a bit touchy together, but they do meet up and they play together. If you go on YouTube and look at sort of the guitar festivals and things, you often find that. And Eric Clapton too, who was a previous Yardbirds guitarist. They all get on reasonably well now by not seeing each other too often.
You co-wrote You Don't Have to Say You Love Me for Dusty Springfield, which became a #1. And then Elvis Presley famously recorded as part of 5 years later or something in Las Vegas. Did you ever follow it up, that #1? And what's it like to have a #1? Is it true that everybody wants to give you things when you're #1, or was it because you were co-write, you didn't, because it was Dusty's song?
Give you what? I like being given things. I was never given much. I got a gold record from Elvis. I went to see Elvis when he was playing in Las Vegas, Las Vegas Hilton. And this was about a year after You Don't Have to Say Love Me had been top 5 record for him in America. So I went after the show, went backstage. I got to meet him. I mean, nothing but, there's a lot of people in the queue. I felt like a groupie. You line up, I've shaken Elvis. But I actually said to him, I explained, I said, I wrote You Don't Have to Say Love Me. Could I have a gold record? And he turned to his manager, Colonel Parker, who was sitting next to him, and said, Colonel, give the kid a goldie. And I was only 2-3 years younger than Elvis, but, I was kid. I was English and sort of polite and nice. That's what kids are to Americans. He was Elvis. Give the kid a goldie. And so I gave Colonel Parker my address. And 2 weeks later, a gold record arrived. You don't have to say love me, signed by Elvis. Thank you for a great song, it said. And a day later, an invoice arrived for $100, which in 1972 was like $1,000 now. And I found out later that anybody who wanted, this is Colonel Parker's side business. Anybody who wanted a gold record, you could be a fan or a groupie or anybody, taxi driver, you want a gold record, ask Colonel Parker, you get one, and you have to pay $1,000, you have to pay $100 for it. And so I was one of millions who got a gold record from Elvis.
Oh. Esmond, not many can say that Elvis recorded
I
that
could
song.
probably get $200 for it on eBay now, couldn't I?
Does anybody have any questions?
We haven't had one yet. Oh, well, good.
Could you tell us a little bit about your current company or current business?
Can I take a what?
About your current business?
Tell us about your current business, what you do now.
I have a show in Las Vegas, which has been in the top 5 shows in Las Vegas for the last 3 years. It's about to have its 1,000th performance. It's called Raiding the Rock Vault, and it's a concept I came up with. Where was I? I was in Bangalore in a nightclub called Purple Haze, and I was in a bit of a purple haze. 1 o'clock in the morning, drank a lot of champagne, and I remember going to the loo, and I thought, on the way to the loo, I must go and thank the band for being so fantastic, because I'd been sitting for an hour. It's a covers band, and I've been sitting for an hour drinking champagne, listening to unbelievably good covers, and so good that I got this completely the wrong way around. God, this is not good. I thought I must go and thank the DJ for playing these incredible records. And when I got up to go and thank the DJ, I found it was a covers band, and I'd been listening to a covers band. And I sat down again, I thought, wow, this is what the world needs. We want a covers band so good you think they're records. I pondered on this, and eventually, talking with a partner of mine, we decided to do it. We put together a band of top rock musicians. I mean, they are the top musicians in the world still today. And they play 2 hours of classic rock songs. And when I say the top musicians, I'm right, the band changes because a lot of them still have to go off on tour with their bands now again. But currently this week we've got Doug Aldrich on guitar, who's a Whitesnake's guitarist, Trevor McDonald, who is Bon Jovi's bass player. We've got Howard Leese on guitar, who is guitarist with Heart, and he plays with Badfinger now, and plays a lot with Jimmy Page as well. All these musicians, very top musicians. We have 3 singers in it. And it's 2 hours of, and it's not really cover versions. They play them the way they want to play them. And they love playing them. Because if you're a top rock musician with a top group, the one thing you've never been able to do is play all the rock songs you like best, because everyone will laugh at you. You can't be a covers band. You can't play other people's songs. But this allows them to, so they really put their soul into it. And for 5 years now, 3 years now, that's been running in Las Vegas. Always in the top 5 music shows. And it's really exciting. I don't know anyone who's ever seen it and not come away saying, and some of the numbers are played better than the originals. And we get all the top rock stars who are in Vegas going and sitting in with the band too. And yeah, some of the songs are better, simply because some of them come from the 60s and early 70s, when even stage amplification and mixing decks were not good enough to give the quality you get now. So when you hear The Sweet or even My Generation, whose song, they still play it, so it sounds very good live now.